Hello, I'm Mark Turner, the External Relations Director of SRM 360, and welcome to our live discussion on climate change, global security and geopolitics, and how the idea of sunlight reflection methods, also known as solar geoengineering or SRM, may affect those issues. SRM 360's goal is to support an informed discussion about SRM. We don't take a position on whether it should ever be deployed or not. However, we do support its research and broad-based discussions on the best way forwards. We've put some interesting new products together, including a primer on SRM and security in collaboration with the Center for Climate and Security, which we encourage you to look at after the event. Dave Levitan, our lead writer and editor, will be fielding questions. Please ask your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as we go along, not the chat, but the dedicated Q&A option so we can keep track. And please keep your questions short and focused on the topic at hand, rather than making statements. Dave will direct some of those questions to panelists at the end of the discussion. So thank you again for coming, and I hope you enjoy our live discussion. And I'll now turn over to Pete, our editorial director.
Thanks. So climate change will shift the globe's geopolitical landscape in a variety of ways, through direct impacts felt by society, but also by changing the availability and demand for natural resources and by destabilizing nations and driving migration flows. While it might not lead directly to war, it could be a threat multiplier, adding additional strains and new risks that could exacerbate security issues around the world. Stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, the idea to add a reflective layer of particles to the upper atmosphere, might offer a technically feasible means of slowing or even reversing global warming, and so reducing some of the threat from it. And research in recent years has suggested that this idea could be easier to realize than previously thought, and that it could be implemented using modified versions of existing large-body jets flown at high latitudes. This means that SAI could be technically developed and deployed in just a few years at a cost measured in billions of dollars per year. Now, it appears some forms of solar geoengineering might be able to offset some of the effects of global warming, but could they raise the geopolitical temperature? In today's discussion, we will explore how solar geoengineering might alter global security dynamics and how policymakers and the broader climate community should be thinking about the security challenges of climate change and solar geoengineering. Joining us to talk through these issues today are three experts. We have Erin Sikorsky, the director of the Center for Climate and Security, a research institute of the Council on Strategic Risks. She is the author of Climate Change on the Battlefield, International Military Response to the Climate Crisis, and previously led climate and environmental analysis across U.S. intelligence community on the U.S. National Intelligence Council. And Beth Chalecki, an associate professor of international relations at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and currently a technology governance fellow at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Her research spans climate change and security, international environmental policy, and the intersection of science, technology, and international relations. And finally, Sofia Kabbej, an associate researcher at the French Institute of International Strategic Affairs, IRIS, a non-resident fellow with the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Engineering, known as DSG, and she works with the French Ministry for Armed Forces on climate issues. Her work focuses on security and defense implications of climate change and solar engineering. Now, before I turn to our panelists, I'd like to open with a question for our audience. Let me see, here we are. How significant a threat to international security is climate change? Is it the greatest threat, a significant threat, one threat among many, or just a minor threat? Let's see what people have to say. We'll flag up our answers in a moment. I see we have pretty solid, significant threat is the consensus view here. So we'll spend most of our time on solar geoengineering, or SRM, and its security dynamics. But let's first define some terms and set the scene. So Beth, what do experts like yourself mean when they talk about security issues? What range of things are within scope?
Right. First of all, my thanks to Peter and SRM for having me here. Security issues, this used to be phrased in military terms. When we think of what's security is. In fact, when we think about international relations in general, grew out of what we used to call war studies in academic political science. And so anything related to the military, anything that required a coordinated military response, any overt attack on a country was a security issue. And we always thought of this as other invading armies, perhaps new weapons developments, but early in the environmental security field, back in the early 1990s, there was a big debate about redefining security. Does it include things like climate change or doesn't it? And there was some people who said no, it was irrelevant, and others who said that it was key to understanding what security is. But a security matter for a state is anything that credibly threatens its sovereignty, its well-being, or its power relative to other states. This could certainly be an invading army, as Ukraine found out. It is also a virus. It could be large numbers of refugee flows. It could be heat waves, disappearing territory due to sea level rise, resource shortages. Any of this could credibly pose a security threat. So when we talk about how do we respond to security threats, we have to take all this into account.
Right. So it's the full range of things that make life possible and their potential endangerment is what we're considering.
Sovereignty, well-being, or power.
And I see nods from our other panelists, so we're all on board here. Excellent. So Erin, can you give us a high-level overview of how climate change is affecting or could affect global security?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me with this great panel. I loved Beth's laydown there of security, because I think that when you look at climate change and what it is doing, right, you've got the direct hazards themselves that cost the military billions of dollars of damage to critical infrastructure every year, that also require the deployment of militaries in response. When you have floods, wildfires, heat waves, you've got militaries everywhere deploying, using their resources to support their communities in the wake of those disasters and taking away from potentially other threats. You also have the direct risk to human lives, right? 2022, huge heat waves across Europe killed 20,000 people in the UK and in Europe, excess heat deaths that year. That same year, if you compare terrorism around the world, 7,000 people died, right? So when you look at that precious human life measurement, right, climate is at the top of the list, but it also exacerbates existing threats. It layers on top of competition with China, for example, or conflict with Russia, in that it affects food security, resource security, right, water access, things that countries compete over. And so climate is affecting all of that and shifting the baseline. I like to call climate a shaping threat, right? There isn't a thing that national security actors care about that isn't affected by climate in some way, and usually negatively affected by climate in some way.
Is it safe to say that sort of any change is trouble when it comes to sort of security? I mean, I'm thinking of the Arctic a little. It's changing quick.
Yeah, I mean, changes can be positive as well. And there's the whole field of environmental peace building, right, which is about using environmental issues as a way to build relationships and peace. I think the challenge we face with climate right now is the change is happening relatively quickly, and the institutions and the planning and the security actors have outdated understandings of that. So when there's a gap between the change and the institutional action, that's when I think you have real problems.
Excellent. So, Sofia, you've worked with the French Ministry of Defense. How seriously are they and other ministries, other countries, taking climate change as they plan for the future?
Yes, thank you for the invitation as well. So maybe I'd like to underline 3 points. The first point is that militaries themselves are huge contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions. They account for around 5% of global emission. For comparison, freight transport accounts for around 7%. So it's quite significant. The second thing is that, as Erin underlined, they are affected both directly and indirectly by climate change. And the third point is that the military culture, let's say, it's not the one most open to incorporating environmental concerns. Now, that being said, regarding the integration of climate change within military and defense ministries, it's relatively recent. In the US, it dates back to the 90s, but the integration and actually seeing concrete translation of this integration through the release of action plans or dedicated strategies, this is relatively recent. One example is the adoption by NATO of Climate Security Action Plan in 2021, or dedicated strategies that was done in the 2020s in other countries. But what I want to say, what is interesting is to look at how climate change is integrated. And most of the time, yes, we do have what you mentioned in the introduction, this threat multiplier, risk multiplier kind of framing. But most of the time, climate change is seen as a potential constraint to military effectiveness and military performance. And so climate change and the way in which it's integrated is more through this adaptation efforts, adapting to a warming world. Now, where are we at? Well, it's interesting to know that efforts has started. As we all know, the current political and geopolitical constraints does put a lot of, pressure on the efforts that were initiated with this kind of false dichotomy between defense spending and climate spending. So we do see that efforts that were once initiated are being a little slowed down, but it's ongoing. But to say short, no military is currently adapted to a warming world.
Am I right that, I guess I'd heard, there's plans across Europe to raise defense spending. And I got a sense there might be a broadening of the definition of defense spending to include adaptation and other things that are sort of maybe more related to those other elements of security than military security. Am I right there, or am I misremembering?
Well, unfortunately, it's true that the current geopolitical context and the way in which political elites have kind of framed what ought to be the political priority and what we should invest first were mostly understood as hard security, what Beth was talking about at the beginning when she mentioned what is security about. And so we did have for some time people trying to push for this broadening of what it should include adaptation and building resilience. And we do have some forces that are still trying to push this narrative, but generally, what we hear is defense first, and then we can think about the environment and climate change. And this is really noticeable through some drawbacks in European legislations that were actually far ahead in link with the EU Green Deal that are being dismantled slowly, but actually being done right now.
Thanks. So Beth, looking around the world, are there particular hotspots when you think of climate change in terms of increased risk and dangerous tensions when it comes to security and climate change?
Yes, I think we have to be careful not to say, well, only these hotspots would be affected. If we're looking at the effect of climate on security and habitability around the world, or climate change on security and habitability, then we need to recognize it's happening everywhere. But there's particular areas that might be of interest to us. I know we're going to talk about the Arctic later, so I'm going to leave that for now. That is certainly at the top of my list. But the MENA region is going to be facing severe water insecurity in the coming decades.
MENA
Middle
region?
East, North Africa. Yes.
Right.
If you look at world maps, if you look at drought indices, that area is already particularly dry. And so future water shortages contribute then to political unrest and so on. We saw this happen in Syria. This is going to make this region more unstable than it is currently. The Central European breadbasket, we talk about Russia and Ukraine a lot, but they can duke it out for as long as they need to, but one good heat wave, one good drought is just going to tank their agricultural production. And they produce wheat and other grains for a significant portion of the world. That's one of their key exports. So the fluctuation there might destabilize that entire market. If they produce more in the winter and less in the summer, that's going to affect food security all over the world. The United States, among other countries, has military bases in the Pacific. And we're going to see sea level rise, make short work of those. So where do you park your B-2s if you can't put them on Diego Garcia? You can't just put them anywhere. So we're going to see the degradation of infrastructure around the world when it comes to readiness, when it comes to operability. We're going to need new training. We're going to need new facilities. This is going to affect combat readiness, certainly from a more traditional security perspective. And then I think I'd have to also add the Indus River Basin as an area of particular climate concern, because fluctuating rainfall combined with increasing populations, combined with political and ethnic and religious tensions, is going to make this an area of real unrest in the coming decades. And that's something that we as climate security scholars need to pay attention to this.
Thanks. So it sounds like, fluctuations in water and the food impact that would have on food would be a key thing. But let's zoom in now to the Arctic. So, Erin, why is that region seen as particularly fraught from a security standpoint? And you'll see we have a nice little map here of the Arctic to remind everyone.
Excellent. Well, I think there are two pieces of the puzzle here when it comes to the Arctic and climate security. One is obviously the geopolitical situation. And ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right, you've had a breakdown of cooperative activity within the Arctic, right? You used to have the Arctic Council functioning very well, even during the Cold War, right? You had this communication among all Arctic nations. But with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and then the ascension to NATO of two more Arctic states, right? Finland and Sweden, the ability to coordinate and collaborate across the Arctic has been challenged by that. And Russia certainly has opened the region more to partnership with China, right? Because Russia is looking for friends wherever it can find them. So you just have a much more fraught geopolitical context at the same time that you have a melting Arctic, right? And you have an increasing access to resources potentially. You have increasing access to shipping lanes. You have a lot more activity going on. And you have actors like Russia and China that use gray zone operations, right? Where they use commercial cover for military or security activity. You just have a lot more NATO operations up there. You now have this wild card of the United States, right? And so you add all of these things into the mix, and it's a much more fraught place, and still a very dangerous and challenging operating environment, right? With the warming temperatures, it's not turning into the Caribbean. It's still a really hard place to operate, and so all those factors together make it a security challenge for sure.
And I mean, this might be a bit of a stretch, but obviously the Arctic is a relatively small part of the world, but it might have quite large ramifications. Because I mean, I guess one sense, the US-China tensions. I mean, one of the things, I may be making stuff up here, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but China's quite easy to isolate because of various choke points between it and the rest of the world. But if the Arctic opened up, that would sort of be a very relatively short route between China and Europe, right? So this could have ramifications well beyond the Arctic.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think certainly China's playing the long game and sees potential opportunity there in the long run. I think also, I mean, you know, China likes to call itself a near Arctic state, and it claims that what happens in the Arctic affects China itself. And, you know, we poo-poo that sometimes, but it's actually true, right? What's happening in the Arctic will affect the climate for the rest of the globe. And so every nation has an interest in what's happening up there to a certain extent. But absolutely, I think also just the access that you can have physically in the region is of interest. And Russia doesn't love China being up there either. Russia likes to think of it as its own backyard, but it doesn't have a lot of choices these days in terms of who it partners with.
And Canadians might disagree on that, on whose backyard it is.
Well, fair. Yeah. So it's complicated.
Great. Well, another Arctic issue is that the climate change is impacting what's known as the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, this flow of water that goes from the warmer south to the cooler north across the Atlantic, contributing to the Gulf Stream that keeps Europe much warmer than other places at a similar latitude. And this is slowing down, and climate change may lead to it shutting down potentially in the future. And Iceland and other Nordic councils have recently called this potential national security threat. Is this a view shared by other European countries? Sofia, and what would it mean to see AMOC collapse this way?
Well, maybe I'll react to how those countries have framed the AMOC collapse or potential shutdown as a national security risk, because we do see some differences in the French context and in how it is framed. And so one question that I think is key is to consider, okay, what are the factors that have pushed forward or that have enabled the recognition of the AMOC slowdown or potential shutdown as a national security threat? And it's true that one assumption can be that, yeah, the consequences of such slowdown or shutdown indeed threaten national security. However, when we look at why more broadly national governments engage with climate change as a security issue, we notice that it's not only the physical impacts of climate change that actually push forward this recognition, it's also political factors. It's the case for France, which I have analyzed. It was more influence opportunities and particular policy entrepreneurs within administration that enable the recognition. And so why I say this is that securitizing moves are also the result of political calculation. It's not the simple evaluation. Yes, it's a physical risk, and so this is why it's recognized. So I say this just to contextual. I'm not saying it's the case for Iceland, but it's always important to consider that it's not because we have this recognition that it's actually a national security risk or how it's considered by the actual authorities. And maybe to give an idea of how things are in France, because I wanted to have a glimpse also of how public authorities perceive this. So I reached out to a few practitioners that I've been working with, and what they underlined is that they don't really perceive the AMOC with as much urgency as do other Nordic countries, because they consider that the probability is still unknown, and so it wouldn't make sense to frame it as a security issue, but rather to approach it through risk management or through the precaution principle. So they, so far, put forward another approach. It doesn't mean it won't be the case. It's hard to predict how governments will approach something, but the signals seem to indicate that the reaction might be different. And if we do see one, I think it would be more at the EU level than just one national government actually recognizing AMOC as a national security threat.
Right, thank you. So now we've given some context on climate change and security. We are going to turn to the main topic of discussion, solar geoengineering. But before we do, I'm going to ask another question to our audience. So we should see that pop up in 1 second. Is it helpful to frame solar geoengineering as a potential emergency response to climate change and potential tipping points like AMOC collapse? No, this is dangerous. No, it's not helpful. Yes, it helps to be prepared, or yes, it's an emergency. What is your view? So we should have an answer shortly. Let's see what we get. An interesting mix. We're pretty evenly divided between the no and yes, but more on the stronger this is dangerous, and then on the yes side, a more cautious, it helps be prepared. Excellent. Okay, well, let's turn to solar geoengineering and clarify a little about what it is. I gave an introduction to stratospheric aerosol injection, which is one of the main ideas. But another one of the prominent ideas is marine cloud brightening. Sofia, could you give us a little explanation of that?
Yeah, sure. So marine cloud brightening, so MCB, is basically another proposed, as you said, solar geoengineering technique, which aims to cool the Earth by enhancing the reflectivity of low-lying marine clouds over oceans. And so the idea here is to spray tiny sea salt particles into these clouds to increase the density of cloud droplets and make the clouds brighter. And so with brighter clouds, it reflects more sunlight back into space, and it reduces the amount of solar energy that is actually absorbed by the planet. And so MCB is currently envisioned as potentially contributing to help reducing regional temperatures. So contrary to SAI, which has a planetary scale intervention, MCB is more regional. And to give an example of projects in Australia, there is one ongoing project since 2020 that I quote aims to protect the Great Barrier Reef against coral bleaching. So this is one example of how it's currently being studied.
Yeah, and I think I just want to re-emphasize something you said there. The distinction between the SAI, which would be inherently global, you've got relatively little control over the distribution, and MCB, which is sort of inherently local, but you could kind of scale up and do it in different patches, potentially scale up enough to have a global impact.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, Erin, could these ideas be weaponized to direct harmful weather against some rival by a nation? Could it be militarized in that way?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think one that needs to be taken in the broader context of where the future of warfare and the conversation on defense and security is going right now. I was just at the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, and there's a lot of interest in how does Europe build out its industrial base, right? What should it focus on? And weaponizing weather is not part of that conversation at the moment, right? There are many other things that are top of the list in terms of drones, in terms of hypersonic missiles, right? And this SAI or even MCB, which are very theoretical still at this point, hard to direct against a particular country without affecting your own, right? It's just not high on the list of militaries in terms of where they're focused or what they would want to do. And I think from my understanding of the science, it would be very difficult to target these at an adversary or a competitor in any way that benefits you that you wouldn't get from a different weapon system, right? In a much more serious way. I think, but it's important in this conversation to understand, though, too, is not just the intent of the user, but the perception of other countries. And I think we'll get into that more, but that's where I see more security risk, that actors perceive the potential use of one of these as a threat or being used as a weapon against them in some way, or that a country might look to deploy one of these and realize there may be some negative effects on another country, but not really care. But that wouldn't be the purpose of the use. So it's a complicated question, but I think is this a weapon, or militaries interested in this as a weapon? I think the answer is broadly no.
Yeah. I guess maybe one thing to bear in mind or to add on to that is sort of the, weather timescales of days, which is sort of, I guess, the timescale of battles, and climate change, which is something that's a decadal phenomena. It's like the average of weather over 30 years. And these are ideas to change the climate in the long run. And so they're, as well as being imprecise, they're also very slow acting and diffuse in that way. So Beth, I know you've got a slightly different perspective on some of this, or have some concerns around how it may be used or how it may be perceived.
I think Erin is right to bring up perception. That's very important. No, this is not some technology. I agree with her on this. This is not some technology where you shoot at another country and you can affect their weather, right? It doesn't happen on that time scale. Quite correct. SRM particularly is a global phenomenon. Where I see the potential weaponization coming in is a much larger scale, more diffuse type of weaponization. Erin mentioned that you can't point this at somebody without feeling it yourself. Maybe that's not a concern. Maybe you do deploy this with some idea towards affecting your own weather, and if ancillary benefit to you happens to be that it weakens your rival over decades, then fantastic, you're playing the long game. This is not something we do particularly well, but there are nations that do this, that can plan their security desires and policies out for decades. So it's not something that we should automatically dismiss as not happening. And I'm not suggesting that Erin did that, but I know some scholars have looked and said, this is stupid. Of course it can't happen. I think that's arrogant for us to assume it can't happen. Technology changes all the time. And if there's a way to weaponize something, it will be studied for that purpose. So I think weaponization really depends on how you conceive of your security, how much time you're willing to spend on it, and how much burden you're willing to bear to achieve it.
Yeah, and are you using weapon in a broader sense? I mean, I guess weapons often are defined, like blowing up a building is
typically. But that's not. There's more weapons than just something kinetic that you point and shoot and it goes boom. There are weapons that are long-term destabilization weapons, and we might call it a weapon or not call it a weapon, but the key behind what is a weapon is hostile intent. Are you deploying this for the reason? Do you want to negatively affect a rival state over the short term or the long term? If that case, it is a weapon. And of course, I know we're going to get into ENMOD a little bit later, but the terms of the Environmental Modification Convention say that weather manipulation cannot be used for hostile intent. But we've never adjudicated any kind of decision under that treaty. And in fact, the parties to it haven't even met since 1992. So is this treaty still considered to be binding? That's an open question.
Is it okay if I jump in here briefly, Peter,
sure.
too? I think it's also important in this context to think about the threat from climate change overall, right? What you were talking about earlier. And we already see actors trying to weaponize extreme weather events against their adversaries and rivals, right? Russia launches disinformation campaigns aimed at Europe in the wake of extreme weather events to try to undermine trust in governments, right? They did this in Poland. China's done it in Spain. They did it in the United States, right? So again, I think just having these conversations about the climate overall and how countries use it to their geopolitical advantage, I think is really important. But I don't think we should isolate SRM in that conversation and talk about it as potentially worse than what's already going on, but put it in the broader picture, if that makes sense.
And just to clarify, when you say weaponize heat waves, you mean when a heat wave naturally occurs,
yes.
spread misinformation about that and claim that it's caused by some nefarious actors.
Exactly. Or use it as an opportunity to target critical infrastructure, right? If the electrical grid is already strained due to a heat wave, then launch a cyber attack, right? We know hybrid warfare is the direction of future warfare overall. As Beth says, everything can be weaponized to a certain extent. And so climate change already offers that opportunity to the bad guys.
So yeah, Sofia.
If I can jump in to complement, I completely agree with what Beth and Erin said, and to complement what Erin was saying, it's we do have a very clear example of how in current contemporary international relations, anything that can be leveraged is leverage. It can be energy, it can be tariffs, it is leverage. And so in that context, I just wanted to highlight that the way in which we approach SRM, it's not only its potential deployment that has geopolitical implication, it's also the development phase, and we are already in it. And the reason why it also has geopolitical implication is that just like other technology under development, the SRM field, it displays dynamics of domination and dynamics of marginalization, which are very important because those dynamics, they set who sets the research agenda, who defines the risks, who owns information. And so all of this is important with regard to, okay, who becomes dependent on expertise and external expertise, who becomes dependent on who actually owns the technology. And all of this shapes the geopolitical context and shape how countries might use as SRM as a potential leverage of others. And another point maybe that I think is crucial when we discuss SRM development is access to data and transparency, which is something that is already a concern with some actors not actually displaying or being transparent. We can think of Startup Solutions, for instance, and in other countries like Russia or China, for instance, where it's very hard to have access to data. All of this to say that if we talk about SRM and security, it's not just in the distant future of a potential deployment, if it ever occurs. There are already dynamics occurring as we speak now.
Excellent. So this discussion has been very rich, and so we are running slightly behind schedule. So I'd like to move on to an Arctic scenario very briefly. But if there's any kind of big additional concepts people would like to bring in at this stage to help us understand SRM and its security implications, we've had the importance of perception, we've had some of the limits of the direct effects. But are there any other ideas you'd like to bring in at this stage before we look at an Arctic case study?
I just want to mention one thing Sofia said about who controls the information. We're assuming that one state is keeping it away from another state or sharing it with another state. But when you introduce private actors who are developing proprietary SRM technology or attempting to do so, now you have a whole other layer of opacity that gives further rise to the questions that Sofia mentioned about domination and about control and about who is setting the agenda. It's not as simple as who has their hand on the planetary thermostat, but it's about who is making the decisions as to what's going to happen to the habitability of the whole planet without taking everybody's concerns into account.
Excellent.
And maybe to add on to what Erin was mentioning, the issue of perception, maybe if it's not clear, just to say clearly that a central issue with SRM is the difficulty of attributing with certainty the potential effect. And so it will be difficult to attribute it to actually an intervention that would have occurred or climate change or the natural variability of the climate. And so it is precisely this uncertainty and this ambiguity that provides a really fertile ground for misinformation and disinformation dynamics that Erin has pointed. And indeed, it can, be exploited not only by those affected by potential climate extreme events to, justify hostile behaviors or to demand compensation, but as Erin pointed, it can also be exploited by third parties. Who want to weaken state responses or who would like to erode public trust. And so I think this is really how we can see that SRM adds a layer of complexity, just as Erin and Beth said, it's added to what we already seeing into already very complex environments.
Excellent.
I know you want to move on, Peter, but just one quick thing. I think it's important to recognize that all responses to climate change come with security dynamics. So the energy transition, right? Transitioning from fossil fuels comes with security dynamics. And so this isn't a reason to not do it necessarily. I mean, not that I'm arguing either way for SRM, but it's important to have the conversation so you can manage those dynamics. I just raised this because sometimes I hear SRM advocates say, well, you're just talking about security as a way to dissuade people from doing this. You're doing it as a messaging, technique. And I think that's not what it is. It is real, and we need to understand it and explore it. And it's not any different than other responses to climate in that way.
Great, thanks. So I think from our discussion, it seems quite clear that the security dynamics around solar engineering depend not just on its physical effects, like what it could do and how it might be used, but crucially on how it's pursued, who's doing it and how it's perceived, how people react to it. And then I think critically, when it comes to security, how states react to each other and interact with each other as it is developed and or deployed at some point. So Sofia, one approach to explore these kinds of interactions and this kind of issue is known as wargaming. What is a war game? And for those of us who aren't so familiar with the idea.
Yeah, so to say it's simply, a war game is basically a structured simulation that models conflict. So not necessarily military conflicts, but it models conflicts between several players to learn about how they interact, how they make decisions under particular condition of uncertainty and under pressure. And with SRM, because of what we just described, the different layers of complexity, it is a particularly useful tool. I won't go into the details, but it's something that is notably praised by defense ministries and military actors precisely to test reactions, to test how, parameters are integrated, how they react. And what's really interesting is that war games are tools for those that participate, but they are also tools for those who organize and conceive them, because they allow to actually understand how the players integrate the parameters we put in the game into their own thinking and how they play. So it's a great learning and simulation tool.
Great. So Erin, you recently gamed out a possible Arctic deployment of SAI in this way. Hopefully we'll be able to share a link to that or some details in the chat. Can you give us a brief overview of the scenario and how it went and some of what you learned from it?
Sure. We gamed this out with an audience of foreign and security policy actors, and the scenario we put on the table was a UK-Canada proposal for an SAI deployment in the Arctic. And we had teams, we had the Nordics, Russia, China, we had an Africa team, I think an EU team, a couple of others, and they all had to react. They had to decide, what do you think of this deployment? Are you going to join the consortium that's doing it, or are you going to try and oppose it? And the big takeaway for us in this game was that, and maybe this is no surprise, that it was really geopolitics that drove the decision of the actors, not the science behind the deployment itself. And it was a lot of skepticism from Russia that Russia would be the key spoiler potentially in this, not because they were necessarily opposed to changing the temperature per se, lowering the temperature, but they just didn't want activity in what they consider their own backyard in the Arctic to be ongoing in this way. The other key takeaway was around trust, and how not having trust and shared information ahead of time was a real hindrance in getting countries, even potentially sympathetic countries, on board, right? They didn't want to believe just what the UK and Canada were telling them. They wanted to be part of the process that developed the understanding of what this intervention might might look like.
I guess a little side question I have, we often present Russia often is seeing advantages in a melting Arctic, but does Russia actually see climate change as a good thing, or is it more nuanced than that?
I think it's more nuanced than that, right? The national security strategy of Russia a few years ago talked about climate change for the first time, and it actually talked about permafrost melt, risk to critical infrastructure, to military infrastructure in the Arctic. We know they're having huge damages across the region there. Also, the melting ice takes away a very nice natural barrier in the north that protects them. And many of the potential benefits, right? A longer growing season, a changing agricultural capacity, they don't have the personnel or bandwidth or like political will to actually take advantage of. So I think the idea that Russia, quote unquote, benefits from climate change is an oversimplification and not necessarily how they see it.
Well, that was just a sidebar. Turning back to
Sorry.
wargaming. No, that's fine. I'm just really curious about that. Beth, you're also working on some wargaming exercise, I believe. What kinds of dynamics? What are some of the limits of this? What kind of dynamics and timescales are these good for, and where do they kind of fall short of, or what are the limits?
Yes, I am up here at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, working on, I'm part of Technology Governance Fellowship, and I'm writing a climate security and geoengineering war game for NATO. And I don't have any results yet to report out like Erin, because I'm not done writing it yet. We go into beta testing in about 2 weeks. But the idea here is basically, can states work together to determine, given the climate security risks they're facing, would geoengineering hurt them or help them? So they have to try to come together to make this decision. On the other hand, they each have their own security concerns they need to pursue and maintain. So I'm still writing it. I'm not got any conclusions yet, but I think wargaming like this is helpful because, climate change is a wicked problem. And if you have a wicked problem, you game it out. You try to learn about the decision-making paths that the players might take. And this is one of the reasons I love running it with students. And eventually we'll get to the professional military and foreign policy folks, but the students come in and they don't have a lot of those historical predetermined viewpoints that they bring into it. If I tell them they're going to be Russia, or if I tell them that they're going to be Canada or whoever, they just go in there and they're just going to do whatever they think is necessary to pursue their objective. So you get some really surprising and creative answers to some of these questions. But this is basically designed to illuminate decision making, not to come to the right answer. There is no right answer. It's going to be, how did you make this decision and why, and how do you weigh your alternatives in the face of incomplete information?
Great. So, wrapping things up now, and we'll go to a Q&A shortly. It seems that one of the ways solar engineering could go badly wrong is if some security crisis develops, whether that's happening in the development phase, like technology is about to be deployed, or whether it's early in a deployment. It seems like it would happen in the early phases of a potential SRM deployment. But at least to me, what kinds of security crises might be expected, and what steps could we take today to reduce those risks? As I said, I'm going to open this up to questions shortly. So if you'd like to bring in some final thoughts in your answer, do feel free. But Erin, I'll come to you first.
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest security crisis we're going to see is around this perception question, right? When you have an actor that pursues this, whether through research or through deployment, that maybe already is in conflict with other countries, they have real skepticism about what's going on. And I fear that sometimes we have blinders in the SRM research community to some of those broader geopolitical concerns. I've heard people say things like, well, I don't understand why a country wouldn't deploy this in the most scientifically, responsible way. And I mean, I could give you a long list of reasons they might, for domestic political pressure, right? Competing with rivals, all of that. And so I think the way you avoid this is more broader conversations with more types of policymakers and actors in the conversation, especially in the security and foreign policy community, that can help you remove some of those blinders. But I think it is about trust and perception and relationships, more so than the technology itself, or even what the actual impact, frankly, of the deployment is. It's going to drive the security risks associated with it that may even then prevent research efforts from getting off the ground.
Yeah, so early collaboration, early trust building exercises will be crucial.
And education, yeah.
Education, yeah. Sofia, Beth?
You can go, Beth, first if you want.
Well, something I was thinking about when you posed the question, Pete, was that you mentioned solar geo can go badly wrong. I hate to sound like an academic, but define badly wrong, and badly wrong for who and when. Those are all key questions, and Erin mentioned the perception again, and I think this is really necessary early on to have some kind of transparent, robust form of international governance for this technology as it's developing so that we can head off some of these potential problems later. I see, in addition to when it's initially deployed, I see it going badly wrong as collateral damage accumulates. If there is collateral damage to be felt by any particular party and it's building up on their territory or affecting their weather systems over the long term, they're going to come back years later and say, hey, we thought this was going to happen, but lo and behold, your computer model was in error, and now now we're in a drought, now we're in constant monsoon, now we're 10 degrees warmer than we thought we would be, or 10 degrees colder than we thought we would be. I'm exaggerating with the effects, but the idea basically is that this is a complex system we're messing with, the Earth's climate. And now we're going to go in there and we're going to try to tinker with it to try to fulfill national security objectives. Call me a skeptic here.
And maybe to just as a final thought, I mean, just like this webinar and other efforts, in a way, we do contribute ourselves to securitizing SRM. And there is, I think, an importance in being careful with using the security framing, or if we do so, really outlining what do we mean. Beth mentioned it at the beginning. Security means so many different things in so many different type of contexts, and it evolves through time, and it's very and so this is why we also do bear responsibility when we have those conversations to not lead them in a way that would basically have kind of an effect of securitizing this against that and having rival referent objects, and that wouldn't be actually compatible. To rival things to be protected, that wouldn't be compatible in the perception again of those that are in charge.
Sorry, I might have misunderstood. Could you just clarify what you mean there by securitizing and making it rival?
Yeah, of course. So in the conversation that we're having, and just like the chat and the poll that you made, is it a good thing to basically frame SRM as a potential emergency response, as a potential basically tool to protect against climate change? But the key question is protect what or who against what exactly, and who is responsible for doing that, and what are the means for doing that? And those are really important questions, because when we do actually frame an object as a security issue, something that ought to be protected from the threat of climate change, and one of the solutions could be SRM, this has political importance, because the way in which we frame things, it also constrains the range of political solutions that are proposed and how those are implemented. So this is, I hope it clarifies what I meant.
Excellent. No, that's fabulous. Well, we've now got a bit of time for questions from the audience, so I'll turn over to Dave Levitan, who's been keeping an eye on all those.
Thanks, Pete, and thanks to the panelists. It was a really interesting conversation. To start, we've had some questions sent in ahead of time. So one here from Matthew Gallagher is about Stardust, which I know a couple of you did mention, but I thought maybe you could get into it a little bit more. He asks about Stardust, which is this private company which has now raised, I think, $75 million to research and develop SRM technology. How do private sector actors such as Stardust affect security perceptions and governance dialogues? Erin, do you want to start with that maybe?
Sure, starting with the easy questions. No, I mean, I think I think from a security perspective, my concern with private actors, right, is you get private actor plus a government, right? Because I think they're going to be interested in selling this to a government. And so how is that decision made? Who's involved? I mean, unfortunately, I think Stardust, where it comes from, the secrecy behind it, lends itself to conspiracy theories and security concerns as well. And so I think that complicates things, and there isn't transparency or accountability there as well. And how are they framing it when they talk to government actors? All of these things make it more complex. I mean, but I think some of those issues are there, whether it's a private actor doing that or a public actor as well. I mean, not all public actors are as transparent either necessarily. So and you could ostensibly have a private actor that was more transparent. But I think the way this has developed has created a lot of security red flags.
And honestly, whether it's Stardust or another private firm, it really doesn't matter. Their motivation is not national security and well-being. Their motivation is not to preserve the climate for the planet. Their motivation is profit, much shorter term than planetary preservation.
Great, thank you. Also sent in advance, this was from Phoebe Barnard. She asks, what do you feel is the most likely form of effective governance of protective geoengineering experiments and implementation? Is there a chance of a multilateral agreement at this fraught stage? Sophia, do you have any thoughts on sort of the likely, best version of this that's out there right now?
Well, not to sound too pessimistic, but I do not think that we can envision in the near future that a multilateral governance framework on SRM that would be actually enforced and that would be constraining could be adopted for many different reasons, including those that we've discussed at the beginning of the webinar regarding the current geopolitical context in which we are in now. That being said, we do need to have discussion about research governance because research is advancing at the moment. And we have, as we were talking about, Stardust actors that are moving forward without actually following the basic principles of research and how this ought to be conducted. And so what we see, and it's quite kind of interesting, we do see kind of the benefits of having less of a top-down governance, more a bottom-up one, where we have initiatives, like the ARIA program that take the lead and actually propose their own principles and frameworks. We have initiatives that are booming into this kind of direction. So it might appear that in the stage we are in and in the coming, years, it will be more this kind of arrangements that can be considered rather than something that is multilateral. That can come out. So we could have something that is a coalition of a few states that propose something that is doable and possible too, but something multilateral and universal is very doubtful.
Just to explain, ARIA is the UK's Advanced Research and Invention Agency, which is has got a large solar geoengineering research effort going on at the moment. Planning field experiments, but in a much more open and transparent fashion than the Stardust private company is doing.
Great. All right, we have a question here from Joshua Glasser. He says, aside from debates about use, do security actors think about actions that degrade SRM deployment infrastructure as a form of asymmetric warfare that needs to be mitigated or at least monitored? So it's the idea of, if we were doing this, there would be these infrastructure requirements. What would sort of, what is the security implication of, sabotage or things like that in terms of how it would affect the situation? Beth, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's not a crazy idea. I mean, if you're opposed to geoengineering, or you're feeling that your state, your region, your part of the world is facing negative effects from this, or you're opposed, theoretically to it, the idea of engaging in some kind of counter geoengineering warfare might be legitimate for you. I mean, we saw what happened with Stuxnet, and that wasn't directed at geoengineering. That was regarded at nuclear enrichment. We obviously took I can't say we. But the perpetrators obviously took a, sneaky way in, a sneaky backdoor to be able to shut down the technology required to further this weapons program. So if you are feeling that ongoing solar geoengineering is a threat to you, then interfering with the infrastructure in some way is a totally valid response from a security frame. Yeah, and I think it's much easier to interfere with the deployment than it would be to conduct the deployment. So in a way, any state or group of states or regional agency, whatever, trying to deploy solar geoengineering infrastructure is going to be facing a very high barrier, and those who would interfere are going to be facing a very low barrier.
Maybe go ahead.
Just very, very briefly, this is why I think that any country or any group of countries that choose to deploy geoengineering, there will have to be some role for security or military involved in some way. I can't envision a deployment of this size and scope and ongoing nature that wouldn't need some kind of protection, and that protection would most likely come from militaries again. And that's just something I think to consider in the planning and engagement. Is like, how would you actually do that? What would you need? And those are important questions to think about.
And also to complement those points, I think that if a country, group of country, a particular actor, deploys this, and I think the question is really important, the logistics and how those could constitute additional vulnerabilities that could actually be exploited for other intents. And we can take the example of energy infrastructures, for instance, that are actually targeted for other objectives. And so SRM and all of the logistics that it will apply to have an actual deployment, this could constitute an additional layer of vulnerability that we already see are being targeted in conflict settings.
Great, thank you. There's a question here, or framed as a comment, but from Arthur Dahl about the need to maintain an SRM deployment if it were to be used over the long term. This is referring to the idea of termination shock, that potentially if it were interrupted, the ensuing warming could be, quite disastrous. So how does that fit into security conversations? Because the idea of it needing to be maintained over a long term, obviously that gets back to some of the infrastructure requirements that you were all talking about. But are there other sort of inputs or factors to do with the possibility of termination shock that you think are important? Beth, you want to start?
Yeah, what came to mind when I heard this question about maintaining SRM or facing termination shock, that of course, the longer you engage in the SRM deployment without, without mitigating greenhouse gas emissions or removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, the more severe the termination shock is going to be if and when it finally occurs. The red flag that went up in my mind again is why we need to have states consider this, because if we leave this in the hands of private companies who are motivated by profit in the short term, then they have no incentive whatsoever to maintain this over the long term, again, for the well-being of countries and people. A state might have to actually take it over if a private company they have hired to carry out a deployment decides that it's not in their interest anymore, or it's not making enough money, or they're not able to do it for one reason or another. Then they might decide that they're going to just say, no, thank you, we're going to terminate this, this month, this year, whenever. The state might then be required to step in to do this. And at that point, it becomes a national security matter, because the termination shock could be quite severe.
So Sophia or Erin, do you have any termination shock thoughts, or it's fine if not? No? Okay.
I was thinking maybe we should explain what would be a termination shock. I don't know if we've done it very clearly, but if you want to go, just so we can draw them and pull the line.
Maybe I'll have a crack. I mean, so basically, yeah, if you offset the warming from global warming, it's only temporary. So the particles from stratospheric aerosol injection last a couple of years before they fall out of the atmosphere, and so that forcing, which is trying to keep the planet cool, would only last a couple of years if you were to suddenly stop. And then the temperature wouldn't recover in 2 years, but it would recover quickly, much more quickly than it would have risen under climate change. I guess a distinction I have, or I think is worth noting, is that many of the other kinds of critical infrastructure we depend on have failure times that are much shorter. So, if you interrupt the electricity grid, you have impacts in minutes, seconds, whereas in this case, it's within years that it starts to materialize. So that's an element that in some sense is a little slower acting, but it's still a very crucial thing we'd be dependent on.
Yeah, and I think maybe from a security standpoint, then a key question would be, well, who would be affected by this termination shock, or what would be affected? And in essence, of course, all life on Earth would be by such a sudden rise of temperatures. And again, this raises key question of what we should protect first, or what ought to be protected in priority from this potential risk. So it is inherently a security risk.
Brilliant. Well, look, this has been, as Dave and I think everyone will agree, an absolutely fantastic discussion. I'm going to formally bring this to a close now as we're hitting the end of the hour, but we will have a couple of minutes, maybe up to 10 minutes at the end, just to wrap up any additional questions. I just wanted to, again, thank all our panelists. Absolutely wonderful discussion, Erin, Beth, Sophia, and thank you, our audience, for dialing in. People have stayed on, so that's really encouraging. It's right till the end, as you can always tell how interesting the discussion is. I would encourage you to sign up to our social media, LinkedIn, and there's plenty of platform for discussion around issues there. We've got weekly newsletter updates, and also please sign up to our monthly newsletter on our site. Also on our site, you can get hold of the primer I mentioned earlier that we put together on SRM security and a number of perspectives. We hope to host a variety of perspectives discussing these issues. One of our perspectives has 4 different experts discussing some security aspects. So there's a lot to find on our site. So again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And with that, I'll hand back over to Pete and Dave to wrap up any last questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, if the panelists have a few minutes, we have a few more questions we could get to here. Sent in ahead of time. This is actually a couple of different ones I'm kind of combining here, but from Holly Olivares and Christine Zips as well. Holly asks, is anyone on the panel working with quote unquote frontline communities to ensure we are not speaking for them or excluding them? There's a couple of questions like this sort of about, the sort of bottom up approach that Sophia, I think you were talking about making sure that the security angles to this conversation do include as broad an array of people as possible. So I guess, Sophia, do you want to touch on that again, since you had already mentioned something like that?
I mean, personally, I don't work with frontline communities in the work I conduct on security. This is simply because the actors I work with are located at the national level, so it's governments and national and ministries. So that's the reason. But when I was mentioning this bottom-up approach, I was actually more talking about the other actors in the field, because security is not just about defense. It's not just about foreign affairs. It's many actors that actually can build and contribute to security. And so in that sense, there are actors that are involved in the SRM field. We can talk about nonprofits, NGOs that are contributing to what I was referring to, building this bottom-up approach in their work. It can also be researchers, it can be scholars within think tanks. So we do have people that are conducting these efforts. And if I can give an example, maybe that could be relevant for the person who asked the question. The Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering is actually trying to build the capacity of those frontline communities. So if you want to check out that work, that can be interesting.
Beth or Erin, do you have any thoughts on that, or no? Okay. Let's move on to, there are a few questions from stemming from the earlier part of our conversation, more about climate change and security risks rather than necessarily on SRM. Tyler Felgenauer asks, on climate change and security, could you comment on the links or not, as you may see them, between climate change impacts, state collapse, mass migration, and the ability of states to absorb and accept so many more migrants while maintaining, democratic forms of government? So this is really about sort of the security risks associated with dramatic, migration and things like that. Erin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, we know that climate change impacts will affect where people can live, right? And people will need to be on the move. They're already on the move because of these impacts. The initial movements of most people are going to be within the countries they already live in. So a lot of rural to urban migration, which absolutely can strain cities, strain governance, create security challenges for those states themselves. As Beth mentioned earlier, the Syria civil war is a case in point of this. Again, not climate change alone, but many factors coming together with a climate change amplifier. And then, eventually movement outside of countries across borders as well will absolutely be a challenge. And I think what you see in the United States now, but also in Europe as well, is backlash against migrants, the security threat emanating from the political response to that migration, more so than the migrants themselves, right? That upends democratic norms and challenges political systems for sure. I think we just have to be careful in the migration conversation at framing it all around that and the timescales we're talking about, but I think there's a lot of ways in which more broadly that climate can contribute to state instability. Even, absent migration, just the population's demands from their governments versus what governments can actually provide in extreme weather events. And when they're not meeting those demands, there's protests in the streets, right? Or there's, you throw the party out of power. We've seen even in developed countries in Europe and elsewhere, this kind of pressure. So the challenges to governance and governments from climate is absolutely there.
Maybe if I may, I think it's so important to challenge the assumption of a wave of migrants because of climate change, because we do actually already have numbers, and numbers tell us things, and they don't show that people affected by weather extreme events and climate affected and that do have to displace due to climate change move from affected countries to Europe or to America. What is being shown is that when they actually have to displace, they move from their locality to somewhere that is very close to them in their neighboring region, where they have extended family, when they can have a shelter, or they move to a neighboring country. And so when we talk about actually the security implications related to displacement, population displacements due to climate change, an important security risk relates actually to the location that receive them and what they can actually absorb and the amount of people that can be absorbed in those locations. So in Europe, and I can tell from France where I live, we have this framing, this climate migrants that are going to invade, Europe because of climate change by 2050, which is not scientifically backed, and it's actually, I think, derailing us from giving attention to what actually matters, which is building the capacity in the countries where people are mostly affected and actually have to displace, and what happens when the capacity is strained, as Erin has pointed.
There's also an additional security issue as well that results from climate-induced mass migration, and particularly, as Erin mentioned, when these individuals on the move don't leave their own state. They're called IDPs, or internally displaced persons, and as long as they don't cross the border, they're beyond the reach of international law. So they can be dehumanized and degraded in any way the state sees fit. These people can be a nuisance. These people can be disposed of. This also raises concerns under international and humanitarian law, and contributes to the further degradation of that kind of law, because under IDP, under IHL, we're not supposed to allow humans to be treated like this. We're supposed to step in and say, okay, if you can't care for these people, the international community will. And Sofia is quite right in pointing out that we're stepping back from that entire model now. Why are we even considering how states treat their own citizens? But the more people that are displaced by climate and weather disasters and don't leave their state, the state doesn't incur any obligations under international law to treat them well or fairly.
Thank you. Maybe one more here. This is maybe going to be a little tough, but we have a question from Paul Gunnarsson, who's actually asking, I think, about some of the responses to our second poll that we put up. So this is just going to be asking the panelists to reflect, I guess, because you were not the ones responding to the poll. But he's asking, he's basically curious about people who said that associating interventions like SRM with national security threats, such as the AMOC collapse, is dangerous and therefore sort of, unwanted. What would be the rationale for developing SRM if not as framed as a response to such threats? Again, a little bit of a tough one. I know this is more just sort of getting your thoughts on what that would mean. If we're not treating it that way, then what is the discussion around SRM? I don't know, Sofia, do you have any thoughts on that? It's a little vague, I know.
I'll try to take it from however I see that I can, grasp on it. But I think something that is raised in the question is the question that also Erin touched upon, is the issue of the scientific rationality that guides or doesn't guide why we even consider SRM or why it would be deployed and in response to what. And so thinking that the scientific rationality, so we have a technical problem, we have a technical response, and we respond to that because it was proven that it works. This is only one very narrow way in which SRM can be envisioned to be used. And we have to actually think of irrational ways in which SRM have to be used, because this is very much the political realm and the geopolitical realm. It is not rational. It is often irrational. And so there are many other rationales why it could be used for other gains that don't necessarily be linked to protecting oneself against the AMOC, for instance, because this is what was taken, but for other purposes that we couldn't even begin to imagine. If we take Russia invasion of Ukraine, almost all specialists back at the time said there is no incentive and it's not rational. It wouldn't be rational for them to do it because it wouldn't benefit them. And history proves us that it's been otherwise.
If I can, to build on what Sofia said, which I agree with, I also think sometimes linking SRM too closely with particular tipping points, like we will prevent the overturn of the AMOC if we deploy SRM now. I'm not saying that that's what was said, but that can be framed that way. I think I'm not sure that's true, first of all. And secondly, I think it can set up false expectations. I mean, that doesn't mean that we don't perhaps need SRM in our toolbox, or we shouldn't do research, or research couldn't help minimize some of the irrationality. The more we know about it, the better decisions we can make. But I think oversimplification too of the way we tackle this, X is Y, is potentially risky also. But certainly I think, we need to look across the landscape of things that could help us manage the crisis into which we've gotten ourselves, right? And it may be that climate intervention tools are a part of the toolbox we need. But to say they absolutely will solve it for us, I think is also dangerous. So
the climate emergency we've gotten ourselves into and apparently show no interest in getting out of in any real permanent way. I've seen scientific articles written by geoengineers who argue that the reason we're considering SRM to begin with is that it buys us time to implement other policies that might actually get us out of this climate emergency, which would be changing our energy portfolios away from fossil fuels and onto renewables, to ramp up direct air capture or some other form of carbon dioxide removal to lower greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. My worry, though, is that the moral hazard flag keeps coming up. Governments are very, especially politicians of industrial states who make their money off of fossil fuels, are very interested in the technological fix because it means they don't have to do anything hard. They just deploy the technocrats to deal with it. And so if we don't start pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, if we don't shift away from fossil fuels, then SRM is just one long dangerous hole that we're going to go down. And we're going to be in more trouble at the bottom of it than we are here at the top.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you very much to the panelists again, and thank you to the people who sent in questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them, but all very good questions. Pete or Mark, did you have any last words?
Oh, just another thank you to our panelists. Thanks, Erin, Sofia, Beth. This was a really fascinating discussion and glad to have you.
Thanks, SRM.
Thank you for the
Thanks for having us.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.